let yourself realize you don't know, not just say, oh, I know I don't know anything, but feel that scary lack of knowledge. Let that sit with you because it creates certain psychological responses. And once you accept how little you know, that is where the curiosity comes in, because then you've created a vacuum. Honestly, it's metaphorical, but it's still an empty space. Anytime we can realize we don't understand, it is good for us because it kind of puts us in our place, but it also makes us cooperative and friendly and curious. Anything that amazes you, go out and feel amazed. It needs to be amazement that makes you realize how little you know and not comprehend everything. Let yourself not comprehend anything.
Put your hand on your heart, look up at the sky, smile and say, hey, I'm alive. Thanks for being alive with me today. Hey, and welcome to Be Alive with Pate Manser. I am honored today to bring you Deana Weibel. We are going to be talking about space. We are going to be talking about life, death, perspective, humility, awe, and exploration. I'm super excited to bring you Deana. Deana is a professor of anthropology at Grand Valley State University. And she is a leading voice in the study of the human experiences of space exploration. So we're talking about a nerd on human experience and a nerd on space exploration. You bring those two together and we have Deana's specialty. And really her work explores how astronauts and space professionals make meaning of awe, humility, and the unknown. And her new book, The Ultraview Effect, we're going to be digging into today. Welcome to the show, Deana.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks for inviting me.
It's oh gosh, my total honor. You know, I've been a huge fan of the idea of the overview effect for a long time. You know, as a person who likes to think a lot about big ideas, life and death, I've really am passionate about your work because I'm very passionate about the idea of the power of zooming out. So we'll get into in a little bit the difference between the overview effect and the ultraview effect. But first, I just want to ask, because your work really calls us to look outward, where a lot of the narrative in personal growth and spirituality is about looking inward, right? So meditating, journaling. So whereas you assert that a lot of these great awakenings in human history from space professionals comes from this profound experience with looking outward. So how does gazing out into the infinite, bringing that focus outward, change a person?
I think that a lot of the way that I came to understand the importance of sort of being aware through the gaze of large landscapes, panoramas, that kind of thing, started in my field research as a young anthropologist in a town called Rocamadour in France. And it is this beautiful Black Madonna shrine that is built on the side of a cliff. But this cliff is like 300 feet tall and it's not straight out. It kind of curves like this a little bit. And so if you go to that bottom of that cliff and look up, it's just hanging over you. And the way that the rituals at this shrine work are, you are supposed to climb the great staircase, le grand escalier, on your knees. And you pray on each step and work your way up to where the churches are, which is halfway up the cliff. And when you're there, you have this amazing sensation of still looking up to the top of the cliff, but also this feeling of looking down. And I became very interested in how rituals placed pilgrims alongside this large cliff, how people had these kind of extraordinary feelings and a sense of, sense of fear, right? People have acrophobia, they're afraid of falling. There's also a fear of things falling on from you. There were stories in the literature and the mythology of the place where snakes would fall on people. I had a nightmare about that once. That was a vivid kind of fear that I had. But then also just this idea of being something very, very small against something very, very large. And when I married a space historian, which is something I did a long time ago, well, almost 20 years ago, 20 years in October, I got very interested in his culture. And when I began to learn more about the overview effect, Frank White's term, it was such a similar kind of thing where you imagine this astronaut sort of suspended against this huge thing, but the huge thing isn't the cliff anymore. The huge thing is the entire planet. And that feeling of smallness. In part of my work about Rocamadour, there are views of the site across the cliff where you see this huge panorama. And my mother, who is no longer with us, she came with me and visited the shrine one time. She was not a religious person. She was not a spiritual person. She was very agnostic, I would say kind of open, but she was looking at it. She goes, I don't know what it is, but looking at that, I feel something. I don't understand, but I feel something. And I was really drawn in by her experience and this idea of emotional reactions to size, to vastness. They mostly come through the visual, but I am aware of some folks, for instance, people who climb mountains who may have limited sight, where the sonar, not sonar, but the patterns of sound, if you're in a vast place, the idea that sound doesn't return to you, it doesn't bounce off of anything. That's another way to have that feeling of vastness without vision. And so I became very interested in how that experience of the vast affects people internally. And I think it's really wonderful if you get a chance to experience those things because they tend to be rare in our everyday lives.
Whew, okay, so you had this experience of being affected by the vast, and then you began to gather, it sounds like, some anecdotal data and some, of course, research-based data on
Mhm.
how that vastness impacts us, and you got more and more excited, more and more curious. Now, you call yourself both a space anthropologist and an anthropologist of religion, which is
Mhm.
so cool. And these are two things that people would probably not often put together, space anthropology and anthropology of religion. And here we have this nexus. So with this idea of vastness and the space exploration and religion, what problem are you actually trying to solve here with your work?
I think I'm trying to solve, well, one of the problems is basically what you just described, this lack of awareness that when you put humans into space, religion is a very common human experience. Not every human being is religious, but from my work I've done in cognitive anthropology, which argues that religion came about, cognitive anthropology of religion or cognitive science of religion argues that there's an evolutionary basis for religion. So we're wired in our brains for spiritual experience. Some people don't want to have spiritual experiences and they don't seek them out, but they do seem to be something built in, similar to how language is built in, right? Different languages all around the world, but the capacity for language is innate. And I think there's something about the way our brains work that makes some form of religiosity, spirituality, it doesn't have to be an institutionalized religion, but something will travel with human beings. People wouldn't say, well, when you go into space, you don't need language anymore. Of course, you need language. So I think religion occupies a similar space where it's going to come with us and it's going to change the way that it's practiced based on the experiences that humankind has living in space, seeing things that we didn't evolve for on Earth, adjusting to experiences and histories and amazing things that will happen sometime on another planet that we can't even imagine right now. And I think that's really important because I've met plenty of people who have told me, well, astronauts or scientists, they're not going to have religion. But if you talk to people, they do. The first interview I did with an astronaut was in 2004, actually. And he turned out to be an evangelical Christian who told the entire story of becoming an astronaut through the lens of God choosing him, God setting him on a particular path. And then he was an engineer going out into orbit around the planet and seeing God or seeing the Earth from God's perspective and seeing how God had engineered this world. And so his religious framing completely colored his experience as an astronaut. And in my research with astronauts and other people who work in space community, I see that not 100% of the time, but quite a bit of the time.
Wow. So this you're finding over and over again in your research this nexus between spirituality, religiosity with space exploration and this idea of vastness and awe. And what would you say is the importance of this research at this moment now in human history if you could choose one?
Well, I think part of it is we're kind of on a precipice, especially I'll just mention the week we're recording this. We just sent a rocket to the moon, right, with people on it, which is the first time that's happened since 1972. And there is moving forward going to be, Artemis 3, they'll do training, Artemis 4, they'll um, return people hopefully to walk on the moon. There's talk about building a lunar base and using the moon as sort of a place where we can launch rockets with less gravity to go out into other parts of the solar system and explore. So, if this particular effort to go to the moon leads to additional adventures and exploration rather than cutting off the way it did in the 1960s and 70s, then we may be on the verge of becoming truly a spacefaring species in a way that we haven't before. And I think at this moment, most people think of space exploration in terms purely of science. They think of it in some cases because of the private space industry in terms of sort of capital and mining asteroids and you know, having some kind of financial investment in space exploration. But I think because this is happening now, and this is something that we're experiencing, and we're going to have astronauts going out and seeing things that they haven't seen in, like I said, 54 years. This is a moment where the spiritual aspects of it can be interrogated in a way that would not have ever been permitted really in the 1960s and 70s. Let me say that, explain that a little bit. There was an expectation during the Apollo era that pretty much every astronaut was going to be Christian. Pretty much every astronaut was going to go to a mainline church. They could be Protestant or Catholic, they were both. But there was a very strong military culture that was part of what it meant to be an astronaut. This was where you had to be a jet pilot, you had to be a test pilot. They didn't let PhDs there were scientists really into the program until 1978. There was one Apollo 17. Jack Schmidt was a geologist, so he was the first astronaut to actually be a scientist. But the diversity now that we're seeing in the space community and the community of astronauts means also that there's diversity in religious beliefs, diversity in perspectives, and it's much more diverse than it was when it happened the first time. And I think there's much more awareness. You mentioned, as you said, the overview effect. Astronauts now are very aware of the overview effect. This is something they talk about with each other. There's an anticipation of getting up into space and looking at the Earth as a spiritual experience. And that's not something that there were no words for it in the 1960s and 1970s. Now, when we have language that can, refer to these experiences, it kind of makes those experiences more real, more tangible, something that people can expect and seek out.
Well, this is a great moment, I think, to dive into the phenomena that occurs, right? Like this more widely now known phenomena of the overview effect, and then what is the difference between the overview effect and the ultraview effect. So for those that don't know, what happens to space professionals or anyone who enters space and sees either Earth or the star field from this angle that is seen by such a minute population, what happens? What is that phenomena?
All right, I'll talk about the overview effect first. A lot of people have seen this image known as Earthrise that Bill Anders on Apollo 8 took from their capsule as they were orbiting the moon. And it is sort of the land part, the part where you'd expect the Earth is actually the surface of the moon. And then the Earth is rising, kind of a gibbous Earth above the moon. And that idea of pictures of Earth from space really changed the way that our culture and cultures around the world understood what we were. If you're on the Earth looking around, you might see trees, you might see the desert, you might see tall buildings, you might see water near you, but you're not getting the idea of the entirety of the sphere that we're living on. Astronauts in space, depending on where they are, have an overview. So when Frank White described this, it came to him when flying in an airplane. And he saw two cars and they were around a corner from each other and they were about to intersect. And he knew that they were going to reach each other, but they weren't aware of each other. He had the overview, he could see from above. And it occurred to him that astronauts around in space have an overview that is unique to where they are. We have seen astronauts in low Earth orbit, which is what the International Space Station does. And they go to this special area called the cupola, where it's kind of a dome shape with different windows, and it's designed to look at the Earth. I think that's amazing. It's a really great example of cultural change at NASA in response to the idea of the overview effect. It's like, okay, we're going to build something so that you can look at the Earth. And astronauts go in there, they take photographs, they will keep track of weather patterns sometimes. They daydream. I've known astronauts who get into the cupola and do art, write music, do painting. By the way, painting in space is tricky because of the microgravity, but there are ways to do it. And these experiences that they have, almost everybody becomes sort of a hobbyist with a camera, have a huge effect on how they understand the planet for most, not all. I've talked to a couple astronauts who didn't really experience anything, but for most of them, the things you hear about are how aware they are of life on the planet, the motion of weather systems, how you think that the storm that's hitting you just sort of appeared, but that storm was over the Indian Ocean a few days ago, and they can track that from space and watch storms go, across the planet. The idea that at night you can see city lights. In the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of focus on, well, you can't see any borders. Those are clearly artificial, which is something that a lot of astronauts will articulate, especially during the daytime. But I will point out that the border between North Korea and South Korea is very clearly marked because South Korea is all lit up at night and North Korea is dark. And that distinction, you can even see the line of the border in the photos that have been taken by astronauts from space. Another thing they're aware of is the thin blue line of the atmosphere and how razor thin that is compared to the size of the planet. And that's the breathable air. There are astronauts who were inspired by this, some who become lifelong environmentalists, some who become dedicated to preserving the Earth, seeing the Earth as a spaceship, as seeing it as a spaceship that we're all the crew of. But I do know one astronaut I interviewed who came away from that with the conviction that we were going to destroy ourselves. He didn't see any way around it, just how fragile the planet was. So he came away from it a little bit more in awe of the potential destruction that was possible. And awe is really important when you're talking about the overview effect because it shakes you, this feeling of I you might theoretically understand what the planet is. And we've all seen, documentaries and photographs, but to have it as a sphere in front of you. And then with the Artemis missions, to have that sphere recede and get smaller and smaller till it just is this kind of blue shape. And during the Apollo missions, James Lovell famously said he could take close one eye, take his thumb, and hide the entirety of the Earth behind his thumb. And exactly that feeling of everything I know, every person who's ever lived was there.
God,
And
yeah.
that feeling of I'm not there anymore is a very strange feeling. So the overview effect, the closer you are to Earth, the clearer it is. But as you back up, you kind of get a better sense of it, but you also lose the fine detail. And so it's interesting when we talk about lunar missions like we're having now to think about how that perspective might shift. So that's one thing. Another one that an astronaut I called Zach in my research talked to me about was orbiting the moon. And the Earth is so lovely because it's all these beautiful shades of green and blue and, reddish browns and yellowish browns. And it's just this living thing. He said the moon is dead. It's cold. It's gray. It's hostile. There's nothing on the moon that's going to take care of you. If you were to somehow need to land and didn't have a spacesuit, you would die very quickly. There's no oxygen. There's no liquid water. There's, at the moment, nobody living there, right? So it's this proximity where you're still close to it and you're still kind of in awe of it. But because it's so barren, the way light hits, it's these deeply contrasting darks and lights. And it doesn't have the feeling of orbiting Earth. And one of the things I'm really looking forward to in the Artemis missions is seeing close up photos of the moon with really good cameras, unlike the ones that they had in the 60s and 70s. It was state of the art for then, but we're much better at taking photos now. So very much looking forward to the images and the feeling of, what if the big thing that you're next to that's causing you awe isn't a nice, friendly thing, but kind of a scary thing? How does that impact you? And then with the Ultraview Effect, the same astronaut who talked to me about orbiting the moon and how stark it was, he talked about how he was alone in the capsule for a while two other team members were on the surface of the moon. And he got around the backside of the moon where the communication with NASA was actually blocked because the moon is a big giant rock and their signals couldn't get through. It was very dark. He was in the shadow of the moon. There was no light coming from the Earth. And instead of just leaving it like that, he decided he would shut off all the lights inside the capsule. And once he shut off all the lights and let himself get dark adapted, which takes 25, 35 minutes, something like that, he turned and looked out the window toward the Milky Way, away from the moon. And he said there were so many stars, he couldn't see between them. He said it was like just a giant sheet of light, and it really threw him. There was this feeling of an awe, but not an awe like, oh my gosh, I'm finally seeing this planet and I understand it now. More of a, I had no idea there were this many stars. I had no idea the universe was this vast. If all of those are suns and some of them might have planets and some of those planets might have life, then there has to be somebody else out there, maybe not just like us, but similar enough. And it took what's called the Drake equation, which is a measurement of, the theoretical possibility of how much life, how many living civilizations there could be out in space. And it was like seeing it literally rather than intellectually. So a lot of people experience awe through their imagination. A lot of scientists do that. They imagine things, they visualize things. But astronauts have a chance, because of the work they do, to experience awe just through their senses and to comprehend numbers through their eyes that nobody has ever looked at before. Grains of sand on a beach is one thing, but when you think of each one of those tiny lights as a flaming orb of gases, the reality of it sets in a way that is very hard to experience for most people on Earth.
Oh my goodness. The vastness, right? What really comes up for me when you describe that, certainly with the overview, but definitely with the ultraview. And I had never heard of this Drake equation before, which is, the possibility of life and the vastness of it. But
Mhm.
then to be able to see that, it sounds like this experience can be quite uncomfortable. It sounds like it can be just obviously profoundly mind expanding, but a little bit uncomfortable and confronting, right? And almost like a dark night of the soul in a way, quite
Mhm.
disorienting. How does that factor into the Ultraview Effect? This notion of disorientation, of confusion, of a dark night of the soul, of this like really vast expansion. How does that factor into the Ultraview Effect, and how does that affect the astronauts that experience it?
It is really varied. So different people are obviously going to react in different ways. For Frank, it interrupted his sleep after he was back. He thought about it way too much. I said, Frank, I'm thinking of Frank is Frank White, who came up with the term overview effect. I'm thinking of Zach. Sorry. With Zach, Zach interrupted his sleep, went home early from parties, he told me, which I thought was kind of funny, and spent a lot of time writing poetry. So there was this kind of break in his understanding of reality that was not, pathological. It was just him processing an awareness of reality that he had not had before. So it's like discovering something exists that you didn't know existed, and you can't deny it because it was right there. And it's not something where you could just go out, even if you go to a dark sky park and look at the Milky Way, it's amazing. But he said going out into space where there was no atmosphere between you and the stars, where he was in total shadow, that was an experience he could not have had on Earth. What's interesting is there's some denial of this that has come up in my research in a couple of places. One is another astronaut that I talk about, who I call Theo. He wanted to have this experience and he sought it out. But the first two shuttle, he was a shuttle era astronaut, the first two shuttle missions that he was on, nobody would agree to do it because he was in this shuttle, which was basically, a single vehicle, and he had a whole crew with him. He couldn't just decide to turn off all the lights for everybody. And so people were like, "No, we're busy. There's other things to do." And I remember him getting frustrated in memory talking to me about it because he was like, "You see so much, you see galaxies with the naked eye." Like he couldn't believe that people wanted to, not experience that they were afraid that it was going to slow down their work. Eventually, he was on a mission with a commander who he was friends with and was able to finally get the crew to cooperate. And they had an incredible moment. He's had more than one example of that. In his case, it was during the 45 minutes that you're on the dark side of the Earth while in orbit around the Earth. So I don't know if how common knowledge it is, but it takes about an hour and a half in the International Space Station or the space shuttle to orbit the Earth. And 45 minutes of that is daytime, 45 minutes of it is nighttime. And so when he was on the dark side during the nighttime part of the Earth, they call it a night pass. He did get them eventually to turn off the lights, and he described what he saw as a solid wall. He said it was a solid white wall. And he said I'm quoting again, it's unbelievably solid up there. And I thought that was kind of amazing. But when I talk about sort of this people who deny it, I've talked to one Apollo era astronaut who said, no, you can't see the stars any better up there than you can anywhere else. But I don't think he ever got dark adapted. I've had a planetarium director suggest that it was perhaps an optical illusion. And I've had a few people sort of skeptical of it, including my husband, interestingly enough. But we were at an astronaut presentation a few weeks ago, and the astronaut was talking about trying to get footage of Aurora Borealis and going into the Japanese module on the International Space Station and turning off all the lights and taking images from there. And these images, it was actually a video that she was showing. It was just stars. It's like just solid, thick with stars. And my husband sitting next to me went, "Oh, that's what it is." I was like, "Yes." But it was great because that was like the first time I'd seen a video that was like that. There's another astronaut who is on LinkedIn, Danny Olivas, who recently posted a picture of a star field that he saw from the International Space Station and described what called a Starfield effect. And I was kind of like, okay, that's not what I call it, but all right, I'll let it go. But that idea of seeing the vastness of space while you're in space, just as long as you get someplace dark and let your eyes adjust, is something I'm hoping that will be studied further. A lot of research has been done into the overview effect, looking at the Earth. And I guess you would have to call looking at the moon the lunar overview effect. But it's tricky with the research that gets done because a lot of research is focused on immediate danger. So I go to the NASA Human Research Program Investigators Workshop from time to time, and they're very concerned about things that happen because of exposure to radiation and microgravity, right? So Theo mentioned that he had to have cataract surgery at a very early age because the radiation up there fries your eyes, it fries your lenses, right? And so that's a problem because you are exposed to radiation while you're in space. The microgravity that lets astronauts float around also causes the distribution of bodily fluids to shift. We don't think about it, but because we're on a planet with gravity, our hearts are constantly working to get fluid out of our legs to our brain. So it's fighting gravity all the time. And the system is designed to fight gravity. You put somebody in microgravity, and their body is still trying to keep fluid out of the legs into the upper body, and they end up with puffy faces and what's sometimes called chicken legs. Everybody's legs get very skinny. All the fluid moves up, but some of that fluid gets up into the brain and starts putting pressure on the eyes. It starts putting pressure on different parts of the brain itself. And there is damage that can result. I don't remember the exact percentage of astronauts who have permanent vision damage from being in space, but it's not a negligible percentage. And so emergencies that cause problems based on being in space, including blood clots that have developed. And I remember one year hearing about an astronaut who was not identified, whose blood in the jugular vein actually started to flow in the opposite direction because of issues with microgravity. That's what's being studied because that kind of thing is, if people are not going to be healthy, we have to, make sure that that's taken care of. If the body breaks in zero G, we have to work on fixing it. But the idea of the emotions and psychology and cognition and spirituality, those are the things that don't get as much attention. There was going to be a space station orbiting the moon called Gateway. And I remember looking at the plans for it, and the European module was going to have three windows, one that was a lunar view, because they were around the moon, one that was an Earth view, and one that was a deep space view. And I got so excited because I thought, oh my gosh, they're building that into this
The
space
Ultraview
station.
window.
Right, exactly. And then it got canceled. So unfortunately, they're not building that. But I am fingers crossed that some of these Artemis missions, when they do go to the moon, that somebody will take advantage of their location and turn off all the lights and get a chance to really see the stars from there. Because what you can see from the International Space Station is still incredible, and that's still with all the sort of reflected light and city lights still behind and interfering with the ability to get to true darkness. True darkness is kind of the key to the ultraview effect. And I'm hoping that we get more examples of it.
So let's dig into what are the impacts of the ultraview effect. So we've established, right? So the difference of the overview effect and the ultraview effect is looking at Earth versus looking at the star field or open space. And you've talked about how it's incredibly taxing to be up there. And also there's a psychological impact of having
Mhm.
the the overview as well as the ultraview effect. But let's talk about, what it there's the benefits as well. What are the psychological impacts of having the ultraview effect and having this the most probably zoomed out view that a human can have at this stage of human history?
Exactly. Some of the things I've noticed have been really interesting with the overview effect, looking at the Earth. Other than the one astronaut I spoke to who was sort of like, we're doomed, we're not going to be able to handle this. Most astronauts that I've talked to have had a much more positive impact, which is, I understand this, I want to take care of it, I want to preserve it. I understand how fragile the atmosphere is and how thin it is. I understand what life is. I understand how every bit of life I've ever known is concentrated on this one sphere. And it is so precious and so important to take care of. Lots of astronauts come back and become very active in environmentalism, climate science, trying to do things that are going to preserve the planet so that we can move forward. I think a lot of people who don't know the space community make assumptions that, well, they don't care if we're going to wreck the planet or not. We're just going to go somewhere else. But trying to live on another planet is not anything we're going to do anytime soon. The issues with radiation and microgravity exist on Mars. Mars has got one third the gravity that we have on Earth. It has almost no protection from radiation. Anybody trying to set up there is not going to have food. They're not going to have enough water. There's polar ice caps, but that's not going to be easy to access. And there's not the closeness of Earth to just send supply ships back and forth. People would die of radiation pretty quickly if we don't figure out how to keep them from dying of radiation pretty quickly. So there's, I think, in the astronaut community looking at the Earth, a much greater appreciation for this planet that we live on now, because it's not easy to recreate those conditions anywhere else. It's not within our power to do that at the moment and might never be. So we'll see what happens. With the Ultraview effect, I've noticed that rather than a sense of protectiveness, there's more of a sense of, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm seeing. To quote Zach again, he said it made him realize, and this is a little salty, Zach was a little salty, we don't know crap about anything. We really don't. And this was somebody who would not strike you as somebody necessarily willing to admit ignorance. He had a military background. He was a pilot. He was kind of a rough and ready. He called me gal all the time. Hey, gal, how you doing? Kind of thing. And for him to have an experience that made him 100% aware that everything we think we know means nothing compared to what we don't know was it made such an impression on me. And I found the people I interviewed, not just astronauts, but also other people who had reached that same perspective of humility, especially intellectual humility in the space community. It seems that thinking about where we are in the universe, which most of us never do, is a shortcut to that. So in the book, I talk about, I look at the sky and I'm in Michigan. It's cloudy. I see clouds. Okay. That's what the sky looks like. It's weather. Sometimes the sun is out and that's nice. And the sun moves from east in the morning and sets in the west. And I have stars at night and the moon sometimes. And that's really nice. But it's not me thinking about that I'm on a planet that is spinning once a day, that is in orbit around a star, that that star itself is in a solar system that is moving in the Milky Way galaxy, which itself is part of a group of galaxies that are also moving in an orbit around a gravitational center. We don't think about where we are in context of ultimate reality. And you have to call it ultimate reality because it's really out there. And the only time that I've found that I'm led to think in those terms is if I go someplace like the Kennedy Space Center's visitor complex, where you're looking at rockets and you're watching, 3D videos about the amazing universe and you're looking at planetary diagrams and things like that. Most of the time, we just don't think about it. And I feel like a lot of people, and I'm going to go back to my mom who felt something when she was looking at Rocamadour, she didn't want to have feelings like that. She didn't want to feel, I don't know what's going on. It was much more comfortable for her to think, well, I know what I know, and I'll just stay in my bubble and, you know, I'll pretend I do know. I remember she was even like that about the physical body. Sometimes I would get really interested and I'd be taking a physiology class. I'm like, Mom, let's talk about the spleen. She's like, I don't even want to know that we have a spleen. As far as I'm concerned, our body's just a solid object all the way through. And I think that is sort of a lack of curiosity in some ways, but I also think it's a very self protective instinct because when you start thinking about infinity or what else is out there or what space actually is, a lot of people, it gives them the creeps. They really don't like it. And one of the things that I'm saying in this book is have those feelings. Let yourself realize you don't know, not just say, oh, I know I don't know anything, but feel that scary lack of knowledge. Let that sit with you because it creates certain psychological responses. One of them is called being shaken, like psychologically shaken, where your sense of reality, like Zach's, shifts. And it just kind of destroys your sense of reality. I think of it as sort of a cosmic reset, where if you can get to the point where you're just like, I don't know what's going on. It allows that humility to come in. And in the book, I talk about concepts that are in religion because I see humility as an anthropologist of religion. Humility is not always practiced in every religion, but it's an ideal in almost every religion. And in Buddhism, you have the idea of beginner's mind, that you should approach anything as though you have no experience. And I think that's the shortcut that the Ultraview effect, whether you're experiencing it through looking at space, which is immediate, or if you're experiencing it through contemplating how much we don't know. It's more gradual, but you can get to that beginner's mind where you accept how little you know. And once you accept how little you know, that is where the curiosity comes in, because then you've created a vacuum, honestly. It's metaphorical, but it's still an empty space. And once you have that empty space, you can start to think about how to fill that in a way that's not just received knowledge, but intentional knowledge, and exploring in a way that is thoughtful and recognizes the expertise of others and combines what you can do with what others can do to reach new information and move forward. And I saw that perspective so much in the people I study who do space medicine, the people who do engineering, that sense of intellectual humility leading to amazing teamwork that doesn't have arrogance and that doesn't have somebody trying to boss others around because they think they know best. And that's such a positive thing that I've noticed in members of the space community, astronauts, and others.
Would you say that humility is a superpower?
I think so. I think humility is fantastic because it allows you to get to what's real. When you don't have humility, first of all, somebody can say, well, I know more than anybody else. I don't need humility. Go to a dark sky park and look at the universe. You don't know everything. The stuff that we're so focused on, all the knowledge that you have, you might be the most amazing genius in the world. You could be Stephen Hawking, and still the amount of knowledge you have in, versus what's reality is so minute. It's so limited. And it makes a huge difference, I think, when people recognize that.
I'm an oldest child, and I think part of what comes with that is this feeling like I need to be a leader. I need to have my shit together all the time. I need to know. I need to not know it all, but I need to know it enough. And I
Yes.
remember a few years ago, I went and I visited a friend who was living on a sailboat out in French Polynesia. And I took that oldest child energy with me on the boat, and I felt like I needed to act like I knew how to like be a useful passenger on a sailboat, when really I had no idea at all. I had never taken a sailing class. I knew nothing. And this really culminated in, they had taught me a couple of knots. And my two friends were off fishing one day, and so I was left on their boat by myself, and their other friend came up, and they came up on their dinghy, and I was like, oh, I'll just, I'll tie up their boat. So I tied up their little dinghy. My friends eventually came back. We're all hanging out. And soon after we had finished dinner, we're looking out into the ocean around us. And someone's like, where's your dinghy? That knot that I had made,
Oh, no.
acting like I knew it all, did not hold. And their boat, their little dinghy, their tender boat, had floated off, and we were sort of in this like very large lagoon. And so my friends hop on their dinghy, and I'm freaking out thinking, oh my God, I've lost their tender out to sea. This horrible feeling. Thankfully, it had just crossed out of the lagoon and was about to go out to the open ocean when they found it. But that moment was a big turning point in that trip for me, because it made me realize that I don't know anything. And why am I pretending to know about sailing when I really know nothing? And so the humility that you're talking about really sunk in. And I was finally able to just be who I was, which is someone who was a beginner and didn't know anything. And can I just tell you the liberation that occurred when I
Absolutely.
finally just decided to be the student and to admit that I know nothing? So I'm curious, what are the effects that you've seen when these people, when these space explorers have this experience of awe that gives way to humility with the vastness of reality and knowledge? How does that impact them in their lives moving forward?
I mean, I think it makes them much more open minded. The people that I've met, especially doing amazing things like creating probes that go off and explore distant planets and creating robots that explore even closer planets, right? So, like different people who do that kind of work, this awareness of how little they know makes them wonderfully pleasant to be around. Number one, I've met some of the kindest, most thoughtful, fascinating people working in the space community. People who realize, yeah, I'm interested. They're interested in everything. That's one thing. That openness to experience, openness to other people's experience, openness to learning, both in the world around them, but also from other people. And so, I come in and I'm not, you know, it- I'm not a physicist. I'm not a medical doctor. I have my own little narrow area of knowledge, but I've run into people in the space community who aren't used to necessarily talking to anthropologists of religion, but hey, let's do it. Let's talk about it. And sometimes they throw them, like the experience of having those conversations that they're open to leads them to new discoveries. I remember talking to one person who does sort of physiology of space and some of the problems that I was talking to you about, and is also somebody who's very religious, but kind of kept those a bit compartmentalized in his own life. And when I started talking to him about, well, is there any form of science that does make you feel awe in a way that ties into those religious understandings? He finally said, you know what it is? It's quantum physics. It's atomic structures, it's quarks, it's seeing the fabric underlying the universe. And that was like, yes, that's the same kind of thing. Anytime we can realize we don't understand, it is good for us because it kind of puts us in our place, but it also makes us cooperative and friendly and curious and all kinds of very positive personality traits that make you get along better with people. And I think about the opposite of that. I give a couple examples in the book. One is talking about students who don't know an answer to a question on a test, but like try to convince me they know the answer when they need to realize I wrote the test. So I know what the answer is supposed to be. That can happen where people do that, or you'll see this often in politicians where whether it's medical things or the way weather works or other large, economic kind of things, an unwillingness to say, I don't know. I'm going to find people who do know about this and I'm going to consult with them. Instead, it's, well, this is where I think the hurricane is going to go, or this is what, this disease can be cured by. And that unwillingness to say, I don't know everything. I'm curious enough about what's actually going on that I'm going to seek out people who do know. That I think makes a good leader. That I think makes a good friend. And so I think that's the goal, really. I think this is something that religions around the world have recognized. And when as a cultural anthropologist, there are systems in place in a number of different cultures that try to keep people from getting a big head, that are kind of, they don't do it the same way that I'm talking about the Ultraview effect, but that idea of cooperating with other people and not pretending you know more than you do, I think is a universally appealing way of approaching the world.
I really believe that what you outline in your book about the superpower of humility is truly one of the most underrated qualities that one can work to develop in personal growth, spiritual development. What is the way for us non-astronauts to build this superpower of humility?
I think anytime that you can expose yourself to things that are going to freak you out is good, especially if it's a kind of discomfort that comes from contemplating things that are deep. I gave a talk a few weeks ago and met somebody afterwards who said that he was very interested in awe that comes about from understanding deep time. So, geology indicating that the earth is, you know, millions, millions, billions years old, and finding objects that are that old, or looking at evidence from civilizations from, 20, 30,000 years ago, where it's just hard to comprehend. I think exposure to things that cause that feeling of, this is too much for me to think about. If you find yourself thinking that, I don't mean like under stress, like I'm trying to solve a problem and it's too much for me to think about. I mean, ultimate reality, too much for me to think about. It might be a religious thought. It might be something that you find in nature. It might be the experience of being on the open ocean. You were talking about being on a boat. When you get to a part of the open ocean where it's horizon all around and there's no land, and it's almost like you're in this ball of sky and water, and what is happening here? For me, thinking about depth is something. I talk in the book about this video game my son showed me, where you go down through the ocean and there's descriptions of what you see at every level, and you go deeper and deeper and you're miles and miles down. One way that I've done just for myself, that other people could do, if you have a chance to, take a bus or drive or whatever, keep a track of the mileage and imagine you're at the top of the water at the beginning, and to see what going 7 miles feels like. Now imagine you're doing that straight up or straight down.
Mhm.
And how does that, you know, the the size of our planet, the number of species we don't know about. One that gets to me a lot is just how microbes are everywhere. The more I'm learning about how we have gut flora, right? You have microbes living in your body, but there are microbes living in the soil. There are microbes living in the deepest caves and in volcanic vents and the clouds. Every raindrop or snowdrop needs a core, and very often that core is a bacteria, and they live in the sky in clouds. And that kind of, oh my gosh, there's more life on this planet than I ever thought existed, is such an amazing feeling for me personally. Like for me, I love space and the cosmic stuff, but the biological stuff is also a source of that. So finding things that make you feel awe. It could be music. It could be music that just gives you chills, where you are amazed that a composer was able to bring out emotions in you. Anything that amazes you, go out and feel amazed. And also a wonder, like the wonder is the important part. It needs to be amazement that makes you realize how little you know and not comprehend everything. Let yourself not comprehend anything. In terms of humility, it becomes important to open yourself as much as possible, in my view. Try things you haven't tried before. Your sailing example is a great one, right? Where you got yourself into something where it was unfamiliar and also a very powerful experience because of what happened when you got yourself into that situation. I find this is probably not good advice, but I find I have a tendency to bite off more than I can chew, because I have some faith that I'll be able to figure it out, but it's the figuring it out part that I really enjoy, because you have to have that humility to recognize there's something to figure out. And then that getting to where you start to know things is fantastic. So do things with other people. Go to Go to work with a friend, go to a religious service with a friend, eat food from a restaurant you've never been to in a corner of your neighborhood you don't visit very often, that kind of thing. And then with curiosity, you can probably see just the way I talk. I go from the awe into the curiosity very quickly. but explore everything that is of interest to you and let yourself learn about things that you don't know about. One example I give is my cousin Tony, who is this amazing classical musician. He plays classical guitar, he's a composer, he's amazing, loves heavy metal, loves death metal so, so much. And I had been so dismissive of it. And I finally was like, tell me about it. And just the way he compared it to classical music and opera and the vocal stylings and the drama that's involved. And it made me realize that it was much more complicated than I had ever thought. And I had really closed myself off to something by thinking I knew all about it when I knew nothing about it. And that is kind of an example of me falling into the trap that I'm hoping that this book will help other people avoid.
One of the ways that I do it, and those were all beautiful examples. One of the ways that I do it is, and this is not zooming out to the whole fabric of, like you said, ultimate reality, but, I find zooming out on my life path, right? From birth to death. And even, if you believe in recurrent lives, right? Like thinking about perhaps the
Mhm.
multiple lives that I've lived, the soul that I
Right.
am. I find that thinking about the fact that I was born, the fact that I will die, and the fact that I am alive right in this moment. To me, that's one of the most profound ways that I can access that awe and that humility on an everyday, ordinary Tuesday without having to shoot into space. And what you're
Great
talking
example.
about is a lot of, seeking out uncomfortable experiences. And mortality is absolutely an uncomfortable experience for
100%.
many of us. It's universal, and yet it is just this thing that most of us, like your mom and the spleen, we don't want to think about it. But it gets us away from that forest for the trees, right? Where it's like, oh, I call it the washing machine of life, where we have the appointments and the dramas and the I'm hungry and the dentist appointments and all of that. And then thinking about it's sort of like a very, very, very mini ultra view is like, oh, I was born, I'm going to die. And here I am at this one little itty bitty point
Mhm.
of my life. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about how mortality awareness and aliveness factor into your experience of awe, humility, and curiosity.
Absolutely. I mean, I think an awareness of death is why I became an anthropologist of religion in the first place. It wasn't something I was exposed to a lot at a young age, but it was, other than through pets, but it was more the idea of, oh my gosh, I'm really going to die. I remember being maybe 10 or 11 where it hit me, and I couldn't not think about it for a while. It was really this scariness that was sort of with me at all times. And I began to get very curious about what people thought was going on. And my mom, who the book is dedicated to, I asked her about religion because I was not raised in a religious household. And she said, well, there's probably something out there. I don't know what it is. A lot of people have a lot of different ideas about it. And I went, okay. And I started to talk to my friends. I was such a little proto anthropologist. I was going to the synagogue with my friend Robin. I was going to the Catholic Church with my friend Sandy. I was going to different places with different, Jehovah's Witness meetings with Lori and, like just different than to hanging out with the Mormon twins that I knew. So I was surrounded myself with people from different religions in part because I was so curious what they thought was going on. What does your belief system think death is? What does your belief system think life is? Why are we here? Where does this come from? And science, I think, is another way of answering those same questions, just from a slightly different perspective. And so I think religions and a secular view all provide kind of a lens for seeing reality, but they never get to the answer that we can be 100% sure about. And I realize some people in religious communities would be offended at me saying that. But it reminds me back to my mom, which is there's probably something out there we don't know what it is. And I always felt like with me thinking about religion, it reminded me of certain test questions in math that I remember where it would be a multiple choice question. It would be, here's the problem, here are the answers. And answer D would be, there's not enough information to answer the question. I always have had a feeling that if there's some way that we can just shout to the heavens, there's not enough information to solve the question. That could be, that might be the right answer. So a lot of the work that I've done is really trying to explore that. I taught a class for quite a while called Death, Burial, and Culture. And while a lot of that had to do with forensics and rigor mortis and liver mortis and why people would think that a dead body was a vampire because of the changes that can happen to the corpse, a lot of it focused on ideas of afterlife in different parts of the world. And I love hearing different theories about how to communicate with the dead, or whether you can communicate with the dead, or reincarnation, or ideas of paradise, or whether you can reincarnate into hell and reincarnate back out of hell after you're killed in hell. Like, the concepts about the afterlife are fantastic to me, and some of my favorite things to teach about in particular. Has it led me to a conclusion? No, but like I said, for me, when I just admit that I don't know what's going on, that feels like the right answer for me.
Answer D. Answer D. I'm not quite sure. And that's where I think we give space for awe and humility and curiosity to come in. Because to me, when I think of knowing it all and trying to keep it all together and acting like I know the path and I know how things work, it's a very tight feeling. Like I just feel like I have to keep it all together. Where this idea of saying I don't actually know, but I want to know more, that's a very open feeling. That's how and so if we think about the way that we want to approach life, is it acting like we know it all and have it all together, and that sort of tightness that comes with that, and that, and really it's a falsehood because we don't actually know. None of us really do.
We don't.
Or do we want to approach life with this sense of openness of I don't actually know. D, we don't have quite enough information to make a determination, but I'm going to keep creating until I find that next thread. But I'm going to keep being open and talking to people and trying to have new experiences in pursuit of knowing. So
Uh-huh.
and I think that that pursuit of knowing is really what half of the fun of life is. And the way that we can do that is, just like you said, is by approaching things with that humility of not knowing. But it is scary to approach life that way. And so I'm curious, with all of this, with considering the vastness of the universe and everything that we don't know, and in your research that you've talked with all of these space professionals and the experiences that they've had, what is it that keeps you up at night right now?
A lot of it is just regular day to day. How am I going to get from here to there? I know you talk about death a lot on your program. I lost my dad. Kind of, he'd been living with chronic illness for a while, but it was very sudden in actually Halloween 2021. And I can remember even that day thinking, oh gosh, that would be something he would choose to do. Oh, it's Halloween. I guess I'm going to go as a ghost, right? Like, it would have fit his sense of humor. And it was very sudden. And I was heartbroken because he was my big cheerleader, right? So he was the parent who loved me no matter what, kind of thing. And getting over his death was difficult. It was hard for me to lose that person who was sort of the unconditional giver of love. When it came to 2023, my mom, who had been divorced from my dad for many years, was living alone. I was here in Michigan, my brother was in California, and he was taking care of her, making sure she got to doctor's appointments, helping her with groceries, all of these kinds of things, really doing like the day to day caretaking. Her memory began to go. We think that she had vascular dementia, but she never had a strong diagnosis. But it was like a quick step down, like she would lose so much capacity from week to week. It was just this kind of thing. And eventually we were able to get somebody to care for her in her home, but very soon after that, she fell and broke her hip and ended up in the hospital, a surgery that seemed to go well but didn't fix the problem, and then a second surgery, which she never recovered from. The same week that she broke her hip, my dad's daughter from a prior marriage, my older half sister, who'd been having some health problems, but nothing I thought was particularly serious, passed away. So she passed away 2 days later. My mom broke her hip. It was a very, very bad week. And my mom ended up passing away herself about 2 months after that. That's, you mentioned Dark Night of the Soul. There was a lot of how are we going to get past this? And one thing I'm sure you're aware of, because I know you've been through a lot too, is that the moment that somebody dies, the person who is experiencing the most grief is often suddenly the one who's responsible for the most paperwork and the most just bureaucratic red tape. At the moment when you're the most vulnerable and the weakest, suddenly this is where you have to step up, and the unfairness of that is just so dramatic. And so trying to get everything done that needed to be done while you're grieving was interesting because the morning my mom died, I was in a hotel. I had flown out to California because my brother said that, she was going to pass soon. And I couldn't visit her until 9. And I had been talking with University of California Press about the book, and I had offered them something slightly different. And they had suggested something more in the direction of focusing on the Ultraview Effect. And that morning, while I was waiting to go visit her, I drafted the entire book. Not, I mean, like an outline, but like, this is the first chapter. This is how this is going to go. This is how this is going to go. This is going to go. Then I went and read to my mother from our travel journal together most of the morning. And that afternoon she passed. And it was this strange feeling of almost this grace of creativity in sort of this last moment. Um, and it just was a very powerful, strange moment for those things to kind of happen at the same time. So that's why I did dedicate the book to her, because it came from those last moments that I'd been spending with her. It's like the book was born the day she died.
Ooh, wow. That's incredible. And would you read the inscription that you wrote? Would you mind?
Yeah, it's at the beginning. And I will say my mother was not my cheerleader. My mother was the kind of parent who will tell you everything she thinks is needs to be improved. So the dedication is to my mother who believed in honesty,
Who believed in
and
honesty?
that was her watchword for her life, to the point of bluntness.
Oh,
But
absolutely. My mother is the exact same way. Yes. Wow. So this powerful download on the day that your mom left the earth. And so as we talk about the ability for big ideas, big life moments to profoundly shift us, I mean, that is just a precious, moving example. I really thank you for sharing that with us. And, that was a very intense period of your life. And I'm
yeah,
sure you're still, those types of things that impact us for the rest of our living days. For you to lose 3 family members in such a short period of time, we are forever changed. And that's where earlier in the interview you said to move toward that which is scary, move
hmm,
toward that which is unknowable, move toward that which is bigger than we can comprehend, so
exactly.
that we can get into a moment where we can get a profound download. Because again, when we're closed off and we think we know everything, there's not a lot of space for these things to come in. But when we are
Right.
faced with the ultraview effect, when we are faced with mortality, or realizing that we're alive in this one moment on this ordinary Tuesday, that's where we can drop our masks, drop the pretenses, and just have this space for what I think is life to come in, for divinity to come in, for creative downloads to come in. And it takes
Right.
a lot of courage to move towards that. But I think, as you demonstrate in your book, that moving towards that which is greater than us, that which is unknowable, is one of the most valiant efforts and the most fruitful efforts that we can pursue in our lives.
I agree.
So the last question is about the infinite. As we talk about the finiteness of life and the infinity of noble information, what does it mean to you right now in your life to be alive?
Ah. It's funny you say that, and the first thing that rolled into my head is to know that I'm an ecosystem. How weird is that for kind of thing? But I recommend reading Ed Yong's book, actually multiple books, but the one I'm thinking about is called I Contain Multitudes. I think that's the name of it. And it is about how every living thing on this planet, including us, is has that relationship with microbes that I talked about. So everything from like the little dust mites in my eyelashes to the different kinds of creatures living in my gut and on my skin, thinking of ourselves as little worlds that we don't really understand becomes fascinating. And he talks about different animals where in some cases the ability for the animal to change color is dependent on microorganisms, or the ability to digest food, like us, is dependent on microorganisms. How we really aren't individuals. We're really each single one of us, a complete group. And the the idea of that, of being alive. Another thing that I talk about actually in the book about life is how really all the life on this planet, we can think of it as one life form. And rather than seeing individual species as somehow disconnected, it's really seeing this one form of life taking all of these different shapes depending on what's necessary. How to live in the ocean versus how to live in the treetops. And if you see yourself as part of a single life form that has taken all of these different shapes and all of these different abilities, I think it ties into actually my mom's idea of mortality, which was she didn't believe in an afterlife. She believed that when she died, she would go back to nature. And this feeling of life being something that exists on this world for whatever reason, don't know why, but it does. And it's all connected, it's all interconnected, and we're part of that. And because we're part of that, what we are lives beyond us, even if you're thinking just in terms of literal biological science and not thinking of spirituality. Those that to me, it's very easy to take those scientific ideas and spiritual ideas and connect them in this life goes on, we're all one feeling in a literal biological way.
So very alive in so many ways. I hadn't thought about aliveness on that ecological level that I am myself, not just a heart and fingernails and a mind and a soul, but that all of the microbes and dust mites and the ecology of me that connects me to the universe. So I just want to thank you today for coming on the show, coming on to Be Alive and blowing our minds with the aliveness of the Ultraview effect, of the power of humility and the ecology of what it means to be alive. Deana, you're an inspiration. Thank you for so much for your work, and I can't wait to see what you do with this moon expedition that's
Me
happening
too.
right
I'm
now.
excited. Thank you so much for inviting me, Kate. I appreciate it. This has been a great conversation and questions I don't always get asked about the book. So,
Oh,
can I
good.
plug
Well,
the book one more time?
please, no, I want to hear all about it. Before we go, we need to know where we can get the book, the title, anything, and please, yeah, show it on the camera here. The
It
Ultraview effect.
is University of California Press. It's part of their trade division, which means that it's a more reasonable price point than academic books are, and it's intended for a general audience. The base price is like $24.95. I gave you a code so your listeners can go online to University of California Press. Just do a search that, you'll find it. And it's UC Press 30, and that'll get you 30% off. And so it's a good deal for that. I do have a website, which is deanaweibel.space, all one word, .space. I've got a mailing list there if people are interested in joining that and hearing some of my thoughts about what's happening with humans in space, because that's what I focus on. And next project has to do with the Voyager Golden Record, which we're hitting
Oh my
the 50th
goodness.
anniversary
Okay.
of in 2027. That was sent out in 1977 by a group of scientists and artists and other folks, including Carl Sagan and Frank Drake of the Drake equation. And it was actual gold record, one on each Voyager mission. There were 2 missions that went out, that is encoded both with sound and pictures. And so the person who was the design director for the golden record, who chose all the images that went on it, everything from animals to what the solar system looks like to Jane Goodall and her chimpanzees, all of that went out into space to talk about Earth and let whoever found it know something about us. There's amazing range of music from different cultures, and it went out on this literal golden record under this beautiful cover that has instructions for how to do it, and even included a little record needle in each package that was sent out. So they're going to have to figure out the speakers when they find it, but they can play it. And we're looking at the cultural context of it, how human beings have been trying to talk to other intelligences for so long, how we started trying to communicate with people or entities in outer space, and different ways that that's been attempted, how the record itself was made. John Lomberg, who is the design director, he's going to be talking firsthand about what it was like to meet Carl Sagan. I love this story. I'll tell you a little bit because we talked about the Drake equation. Carl Sagan knew Frank Drake very well. They partnered on a lot of things. When John Lomberg first met Carl Sagan, it was in an airport. Instead of holding up a sign that said Carl Sagan, he held up a sign with the Drake equation on it. And Carl Sagan found him right
He's
away.
like, okay, this is all for me.
I know what that is.
Yeah.
And then we're going to talk about sort of the legacy and how the golden record has impacted our culture in the last 50 years. And in part of my research for this, I've met so many people with tattoos of elements of the golden record's cover, including a map of where we are with regard to different pulsars, so that intelligent species somehow could find it and go, oh, that's where they are, and locate us. So it's really captured the imagination, and it's going to be the 50th anniversary, and it's going to be with Profile Books out of the UK, and we are very, very excited about it. So that's for August
Wonderful.
2027.
Okay, well, look
And my
for that.
husband, Glenn Swanson, he's the historian who's going to be providing sort of the fantastic. He's a former chief historian at the Johnson Space Center, so he knows his space history very well.
Wow, we've got the dream team on this one, y'all. So,
Yes.
yes, get your copy of the Overview Effect and look for the book about the golden
Ultraview.
record or the Ultraview Effect. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. Uh,
They can
get
find the overview
your
effect
copy of
too.
no. We'll fix that. Get your copy of the Ultraview Effect and look for Deana Weibel's book on the golden record coming in 2027. It's been an honor to have you on today. And we'll put that 30% off coupon in the show notes so that people can go get their copy. And we'll be in touch. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your
Thank you.
weird and wonderful curiosity and humility with us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thank you for listening to this episode of Be Alive with Kate Manzer. And thank you for listening to any episode of Be Alive with Kate Manzer that you have ever listened to. It seriously means so much to me. You guys, we are coming up on 1 year of this show. What? Yes, and I am not going anywhere. In fact, I am doubling down. I have the most epic and beautiful, exciting season 2, year 2 planned for you. We are going to go even more deeply into the science, philosophy, psychology, and woo-woo of the wild and wonderful experience of being alive, as well as one of my personal favorites, as you know, mortality awareness, mystical experience, and beyond. It's going to be so, so good. Thanks for being here. Share this with a friend, subscribe, and let's let this little show shine its light wherever it's meant to, but with the help of your sharing. Thank you so much. All my love. Thanks for being alive with me today.